In my last video about depth of field, I threw around the term crop factor, and I just wanted to clarify that definition just in case you're a little blurry on the subject. Crop factor is how we calculate our angle of view, or our focal length equivalent, when we're working with different crop sensors. We use a full frame camera sensor as a base for our crop factor. The full frame sensor was modeled after the 35mm film format and does not have a crop factor. Or you can say that the crop factor is 1. Therefore, a 50mm lens on a full frame sensor will give us an angle of view that we've standardized as the look of a 50mm lens. So any camera that has a crop sensor, a sensor smaller than full framed, will have a more cropped or zoomed in image when you compare it to a full frame. Therefore, when you put the same 50mm lens on a crop sensor, it looks more zoomed in. So how zoomed in is it, and what do these different crop factors look like? For full frame, like we've said before, has a crop factor of 1, and APS-C has a crop factor of 1.5. APS-C for Canon has a crop factor of 1.6, and Micro Four Thirds has a crop factor of 2. So if you want to compare the angle of view equivalent from these crop factors to a full frame, you'll have to multiply your focal length on the lens you're using by the crop factor. Going back to our 50mm on a full frame lens, that same 50mm lens will look more like a 75mm on an APS-C lens, an 80mm on an APS-C for Canon, and a 100mm for Micro Four Thirds. If you've noticed, during this video, I've always said angle of view or focal length equivalent, but never just focal length, because the crop sensor doesn't actually change the focal length. The actual lens never changes, just our angle of view. With a crop sensor, our angle of view just gets more narrow. So although a 50mm looks more like a 100mm on a Micro Four Thirds, the lens itself is still a 50mm. Unfortunately, I do not have a full frame camera, but I do have an APS-C and a Micro Four Thirds. So to give you an idea of crop factor visually, I have 2 shots, one on each camera, set to the same distance and with a 35mm lens. As you can see, the Micro Four Thirds camera, which has a higher crop factor, looks more zoomed in than the APS-C, even at the same distance and with the same lens. Something to note is that the Micro Four Thirds lens is not getting any benefit that would come with a 70mm lens, like more lens compression. That's because once again, the lens is still a 35mm, just the angle of view is more narrow. Something that I wondered after first learning this was, what about the lenses that were designed for crop sensors? Do you still have to apply a crop factor to those? And the answer is yes, you do. Because what makes a lens, let's say 50mm, has nothing to do with the sensor. It's all the measurements within the lens that determines that focal length. So just because you change the sensor, you change the attachment for each camera, doesn't change how lenses are built. So you still have to do the crop factor, even for lenses designed for APS-C and Micro Four Thirds cameras. But let me say you only really need to worry about this if you're trying to match a full frame camera and a crop sensor camera and have roughly the same frame. Because if you're shooting on a cropped lens sensor, you've probably already become accustomed to what lenses look like on your camera. So it doesn't really matter what it would look like on a full frame. You're not shooting on a full frame. You're shooting on a crop sensor. So it looks like whatever it looks like on your screen. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, because in the end, you pick the lens that looks best to you and works best for your story. You take an amazing shot, you take that shot to the bank, and you cash it in. If you're looking for some more filmmaking tools, there's another link in the description that has a free lighting ebook, lighting diagrams, and a free shot list. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on my next video, even though you already know it's every Friday.